Lieutenant Commander Ta-Min Park stood at the viewport of the medical bay, watching the stars drift by. The Galileo had been on its survey mission for 3 months now, charting the edges of the Epsilon sector. Routine work, but Ta-Min didn't mind. After the chaos of the Martian conflict, routine was welcome. His comm unit chimed. Medical to bridge. Medical to bridge. Ta-Min tapped his wrist device. Park here. Captain Hejun's voice came through clearly. Ta-Min, we've detected an escape pod on long-range scanners. Life signs are weak but present. Non-human. ETA 15 minutes. I'll prepare for emergency treatment, Ta-Min replied, already moving to ready the medical bay. His mind raced through possibilities. There weren't many known species in this sector. The medical team worked quickly, setting up containment fields and preparing universal diagnostic equipment. Ta-Min checked the xenobiology database on his tablet, reviewing the most likely species they might encounter. Bringing the pod in now, announced the hangar chief over the comm. Be advised, it's heavily damaged. Must have been drifting for weeks. Ta-Min grabbed his emergency kit and hurried to the hangar. The pod looked like it had been through a war zone. Scorch marks across its hull, a cracked viewport, and dents that suggested weapons fire rather than space debris. The hangar crew worked carefully to open the sealed hatch. As it finally gave way with a hiss of escaping air, Ta-Min got his first look at their unexpected visitor. She was humanoid, but clearly alien. Her skin had an opalescent quality that shifted colors with her shallow breathing. Delicate markings traced patterns across her forehead and down her arms, not tattoos, but natural bioluminescent features that pulsed weakly. Her hair resembled fine silver filaments that seemed to float slightly despite the ship's gravity. She's Illyrian, Ta-Min said in surprise. The reclusive species was known for their advanced technology and strict isolation policies. Meeting one outside their carefully guarded territory was almost unheard of. Her condition was critical. Multiple lacerations across her torso oozed a pale blue fluid. Burns marked her left side, and a deep gash ran along her right leg. Most concerning was the erratic way her markings pulsed. Ta-Min remembered from his xenobiology courses that the bioluminescence was tied to their circulatory system. Let's move her carefully, he ordered. Set up a level 3 containment field in medical. Their biology is oxygen-based, but requires higher nitrogen levels than we do. As they transferred her to a gurney, her eyes fluttered open. They were entirely silver with no visible pupils, yet Ta-Min could feel her focus on him. Safe, she whispered, the universal translator in his comm unit struggling to process her language. You're on the human research vessel Galileo, Ta-Min assured her. I'm Lieutenant Commander Park, Chief Medical Officer. We'll take care of you. Her hand reached out, surprisingly strong despite her injuries, and gripped his arm. Asylum. The translator finally rendered. Political asylum. Then her eyes closed as she lost consciousness again. Back in the medical bay, Ta-Min faced his first challenge. The medical database had only basic information about Illyrian physiology, enough to know that standard human treatments could kill her. Her cellular structure is breaking down, said Nurse Subin, looking at the scanner readings. Something's attacking her from the inside. Ta-Min examined the readings more closely. It's not an infection. It looks like some kind of toxin. He input commands to analyze the chemical composition of her blood. Captain to medical, his comm unit chimed. Status report. She's alive but critical, Ta-Min reported. Captain, she requested political asylum before losing consciousness, and there's evidence her pod was attacked. A pause. Understood. The nearest Illyrian outpost is 3 weeks away at maximum speed. Do what you can for her. I'll contact command about the asylum request. Hours passed as Ta-Min worked. The toxin was sophisticated, designed specifically for Illyrian biology. Someone had tried to assassinate her. Her name is Jia, Ta-Min told his team after the translator finally decoded more of her mumbled words. She seems to hold some important political position. By the second day, Jaya's condition had worsened. The standard detoxification protocols weren't working fast enough. Tai Min had barely slept, poring over the limited data on Illyrian biology. Their cellular regeneration relies on specific light frequencies, he realized, studying an old research paper. Su Bin helped me modify the radiation therapy equipment to emit pulses at 320 nanometers. It was a risk, but they were running out of options. As the modified light washed over Jaya's body, her luminescent markings responded, glowing more steadily. "It's working," Su Bin said, watching the monitors. "The toxin levels are dropping." On the third day, Jaya finally stabilized. Tai Min sat beside her bed, exhausted but satisfied. He had adapted human medical techniques to an alien physiology with minimal information, a feat few doctors could claim. Her silver eyes opened, clearer now. "You saved me," she said, the translator handling her language more smoothly after processing more samples. "It's my job," Tai Min smiled. "How are you feeling?" "Alive. Thanks to you." She struggled to sit up, and Tai Min gently helped her. "I must speak with your captain. I carry information vital to both our peoples." "You need to rest first," Tai Min insisted. "The toxin is neutralized, but your body needs time to recover." Jaya looked at him intently. "You understand our biology well for a human." "I had to learn quickly," he admitted. "Your physiology is fascinating. The way your bioluminescence connects to your circulatory and nervous systems is unlike anything I studied." Something in her expression changed, a deepening respect, perhaps. "Among my people, understanding another's essence is a profound act." She reached out, touching his hand. "You have seen my inner light. Do you know what that means to an Illyrian?" Before Tai Min could answer, the ship's alarm sounded. Captain Hejun's voice came through the comm system. "All stations alert. Illyrian vessel approaching at high speed. They're demanding we turn over our guest." Jaya's markings flashed rapidly in what Tai Min now recognized as fear. "They found me. The ones who tried to kill me." Tai Min stood, suddenly protective. "You requested asylum. We'll honor that." He didn't understand yet what saving her life would mean for both of them in Illyrian culture. He only knew that he had made a connection with this mysterious alien woman, one that transcended their different species and worlds. And he would not abandon her now. The Galileo trembled slightly as the Illyrian vessel moved into position alongside it. Through the medical bay viewport, Tai Min could see its sleek, silver hull gleaming in the starlight. Unlike the practical, modular design of human ships, the Illyrian craft looked almost grown rather than built, with smooth organic curves and no visible seams. "They're hailing us again," Captain Hejun's voice came through the comm. "I'm stalling them, but I need information. Is our guest able to speak with me?" Jaya sat up straighter in her bed, her luminescent markings pulsing with determination. "I can speak now." Tai Min helped her stand, noticing how she leaned against him for support. "Are you sure you're strong enough?" "I must be," she said simply. Her silver eyes met his. "These are not representatives of my government. They are members of the Shade Covenant, a group that has infiltrated our highest councils. They want me dead because I discovered their plan to break our isolation and sell Illyrian technology to the highest bidders." As they made their way to the bridge, Tai Min supported Jaya with an arm around her waist. Her body felt lighter than a human's and slightly cooler to the touch. The crew they passed stared openly. Most had never seen an Illyrian before. On the bridge, Captain Hejun turned from the main view screen where the face of an Illyrian male was frozen mid-transmission. The captain's expression was grim. "Dr. Park, I see our guest is mobile. Good." He nodded to Jaya. "I'm Captain Hejun. We've received demands for your immediate transfer to the Illyrian vessel. They claim you're a dangerous criminal who stole state secrets." Jaya straightened as much as her injuries allowed. "I am diplomatic envoy Jia of House Talasra. I serve on the Council of 16 that governs all Illyrian territories." Her voice grew stronger with each word. Those pursuing me are traitors who have seized control of several council positions. I have evidence of their crimes. The captain studied her for a moment, then nodded. I've already informed Earth Command about your asylum request. Until I receive orders otherwise, you remain under our protection. He turned to the communications officer. Open the channel again. The view screen flickered to life, showing the stern face of the Illyrian commander. His markings were darker than Jaya's, pulsing with barely contained anger. Captain Ho-jun, the commander said, his words translated by the ship's computer. We grow impatient. The criminal must be returned immediately. Commander Kunwu, Jaya said before the captain could respond. Your actions violate council law. Does Speaker Nayoung know you pursue a diplomatic envoy outside our territory? The commander's markings flashed in surprise, then narrowed his eyes. The traitor lives. How unfortunate. His gaze shifted to Ta Min, who still supported Jia, and with human assistance. Most interesting. Something in his tone made Ta Min uneasy. The commander continued, Captain, know that harboring this fugitive violates our non-interference treaties. Return her, or there will be consequences. We have received a formal request for asylum. Captain He-jun replied evenly. Under interstellar law, we must evaluate this request before taking any action. We will maintain position and continue discussions. The commander's markings pulsed rapidly. Very well. You have 12 hours to reconsider. The transmission cut off. 12 hours isn't much time, the captain sighed. We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. He turned to Jia. I need everything you can tell me about this Shade Covenant and why they want you eliminated. Jia nodded. I will share all I know. But first, she turned to Ta Min, performing a small formal gesture with her hands that the translator didn't catch. I must properly thank my lifebinder for his service to me. Ta Min looked puzzled. You're what? In our culture, Jayat explained, one who saves another's life when death seems certain forms a sacred bond. You have seen my inner light faltering and restored it. You have touched my essence and preserved it. This creates the deepest connection two beings can share. Captain He-jun raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Ta Min shifted uncomfortably. I was just doing my job, he said. Any doctor would have done the same. Jaya's markings pulsed in what might have been amusement. Perhaps, but it was you who did it. The bond exists regardless of intent. She performed another formal gesture. I honor the debt between us. Later, in the ship's conference room, Jayat explained the political situation on her homeworld, while officers of the Galileo listened intently. Ta Min noticed how the crew treated her with increasing respect as she spoke with clarity and intelligence about complex political machinations. The Shade Covenant began as a legitimate movement advocating for limited cultural exchange with other species, she explained. But its leadership was corrupted by those seeking profit from our advanced technology. They've been secretly meeting with representatives from several species, including some humans from private corporations. Captain He-jun leaned forward. Is that why they're so determined to silence you? Because you discovered these illegal negotiations? Partly, Jaya nodded. But what truly condemned me was discovering their planned coup. They intend to assassinate 5 key council members during the lunar convergence ceremony next month. With those deaths, they would control the council majority. As the meeting continued, Ta Min observed Jaya carefully. Though still recovering, she carried herself with dignity. When she explained complex political relationships, her markings shifted in patterns that seemed to emphasize her points, a form of nonverbal communication the humans couldn't fully comprehend. After the briefing concluded, Ta Min escorted Jaya back to the medical bay for rest. In the corridor, they encountered crew members who bowed slightly to Jaya, and surprisingly, to Ta Min as well. Why are they bowing to me? Ta Min asked quietly. Jaya's markings pulsed in that pattern he was beginning to recognize as amusement. Commander Kunwu saw you supporting me. He recognized the life bond between us. The crew has been researching Illyrian customs since then. And what exactly does this life bond mean? Ta Min asked, suddenly concerned. Jaya stopped walking and turned to face him directly. It means different things in different circumstances. Between warriors, it creates a blood alliance. Between families, it merges their houses. She paused, her markings shifting to a softer pattern. Between unattached adults of compatible status, it traditionally leads to union. Union? Ta Min repeated, eyes widening as understanding dawned. You mean marriage? That is your closest concept, yes, Jaya said calmly. Though it is both more and less than your human marriages, more binding, yet more flexible in its forms. Before Ta Min could respond, his comm unit chimed. Dr. Park to bridge, urgent, came the captain's voice. The Illyrian vessel is powering weapons. He Jun informed them when they arrived. It seems they've decided not to wait 12 hours after all. On the view screen, the elegant Illyrian ship's hull was shifting, revealing previously hidden weapon ports. Jaya's markings pulsed rapidly. They wouldn't dare attack a human vessel, she said, but her tone lacked conviction. Captain He Jun's expression was grim. They might if they're desperate enough. And something tells me they are. Ta Min looked at Jaya, seeing not just an alien diplomat, but a person caught in a dangerous struggle. Whatever this life bond might mean for his future, right now it meant one thing. He was committed to her safety and her cause. As the Galileo's alert sirens began to wail, he knew their cultural awakening was just beginning. The Galileo's shields flared blue as the first shot from the Illyrian vessel struck. The impact sent vibrations through the deck plating, causing Jaya to stumble. Ta Min caught her instinctively. All hands to battle stations, Captain He Jun ordered, his voice steady despite the crisis. Evasive pattern delta. Return fire, warning shots only. Ta Min guided Jia to a secure seat as the ship lurched again. I need to get to medical, he told her. There might be injuries. Jaya gripped his arm, her silver eyes intense. They will not stop. Kunwu would rather destroy this ship than let me live to expose the Covenant. The tactical officer called out, Captain. 3 smaller craft launching from the Illyrian vessel. On the view screen, sleek boarding shuttles emerged from the larger ship, their trajectory clearly aimed at the Galileo. They're trying to board us, the security chief said. Boarding points will be lower deck airlocks. Captain He Jun turned to Ta Min and Jia. Doctor, get our guest to secure medical. I need her alive and well if we're going to resolve this diplomatically. As they hurried through the corridors, emergency lights pulsed red. Crew members rushed past, heading to defensive positions. Ta Min's comm unit crackled with reports of breaches on the lower decks. In the medical bay, Ta Min sealed the doors and prepared emergency supplies. Jia watched him work, her luminescent markings pulsing with what he now recognized as anxiety. You move with purpose, she observed. You have seen combat before. Ta Min nodded as he checked a medical scanner. Martian conflict, 3 years ago. I served on a medical frigate near the front lines. A distant explosion shook the ship. Jaya's markings dimmed slightly. This violence is my fault. Your people should not suffer for Illyrian politics. This isn't on you, Ta Min replied firmly. The Covenant made their choice when they decided to attack a research vessel. The comm system crackled. Bridge to Dr. Park. Intruders are advancing toward medical. Security team en route. But they may not arrive in time. Ta Min moved quickly to a locked cabinet and entered his access code. Inside were emergency weapons, standard issue for all department heads. He took out a stun pistol. Can you use this? He asked Jaya, offering her a second pistol. She took it with practiced ease. My diplomatic position doesn't preclude combat training. They positioned themselves behind medical equipment, creating a defensive position facing the doors. Minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by distant sounds of fighting. If we survive this, Jaya said suddenly, you will face a difficult choice. The life bond between us has been witnessed by Kunwu. Word will spread among my people. Tai Min glanced at her. You mentioned union before. Is there no other form this bond can take? There are alternatives, but Jaya was interrupted as the medical bay doors shuddered under impact. Someone was trying to force entry. The doors slid open with a hydraulic groan. 2 Illyrian soldiers stepped through, weapons raised. Their markings were darker than Jaya's, pulsing with aggressive patterns. Envoy Jaya, one said in the Illyrian language, which the translator rendered in a flat tone. By order of the acting council, you are to be returned for judgment. The acting council has no legitimacy, Jaya replied, standing tall despite her injuries. You serve traitors, not Illyria. The soldiers advanced slowly. One pointed his weapon at Ta Min. The human is irrelevant. Step aside. He is my life binder, Jaya stated firmly. To threaten him is to violate our most sacred law. Both soldiers hesitated, their markings pulsing in confusion. They exchanged glances. Impossible, the lead soldier finally said. The ancient bonds cannot form across species. Yet it has happened, Jaya insisted. Ask Kunwu. He saw the truth of it. Before the soldiers could respond, the ship rocked violently. The lights flickered, then stabilized. Captain Hejun's voice came over the comm. All hands, brace for impact. Earth Alliance vessels arriving. They are engaging the Illyrian ship. The distraction was enough. Tai Min fired his stun pistol at one soldier while Jaya hit the other. Both collapsed to the floor, their weapons clattering away. Hours later, after the Illyrian vessel had retreated and the Alliance ships had secured the Galileo, Tai Min found himself in a most unexpected situation. He sat in the ship's formal conference room across from 3 Illyrian officials who had arrived on the Alliance flagship. These were not Covenant members, but representatives of the legitimate Illyrian government, sent to investigate once Earth Command had relayed news of the attack. Jaya sat beside him, now dressed in formal Illyrian attire provided by the officials. Her markings pulsed with calm dignity. The lead Illyrian, who had introduced himself as Senior Counselor Yunho, studied Ta Min with unsettling intensity. So you are the human who saved Envoy Jia, he said finally, and in doing so, initiated the life bond. Ta Min nodded uncomfortably. I was performing my duties as a doctor. I didn't know about any bond at the time. Yunho's markings pulsed in what might have been amusement. Intent does not alter reality, Dr. Park. The bond exists regardless of your knowledge of our customs. Another official, whose name translated as Bin, leaned forward. This is unprecedented. No recorded life bond has ever formed between an Illyrian and a non-Illyrian. Yet the signs are unmistakable, said the third official, Counselor Hawan. Envoy Jaya's life energy patterns show the distinctive resonance of a formed bond. She turned to Jaya. You feel it too, do you not? Jaya nodded, her markings shifting to a pattern Tai Min hadn't seen before. I do. It is as real as any bond I have witnessed between our kind. Counselor Yunho steepled his fingers. Then we must address the implications. By our oldest laws, a life bond between unattached adults of compatible status leads to union. The purpose of such laws was to protect both parties, especially the saved, who might otherwise face exploitation from the one who held their life in their hands. Tai Min felt a chill run down his spine. I would never exploit Jaya's gratitude. Perhaps not, Counselor Bin said, but the law exists to protect against those who would. It has served our society for millennia, and now presents us with a dilemma. Counselor Hawan added, do our laws apply when one party is not Illyrian? If we say no, we diminish the sanctity of the life bond itself. If we say yes, we create a precedent for interspecies unions that many will find troubling. Tai Min looked at Jaya, who met his gaze steadily. Her markings pulsed in a pattern he was beginning to associate with reassurance. There is another factor to consider, Jaya said to the counselors. The Covenant knows of this bond. They will use any decision you make as propaganda. If you rule the bond invalid because Dr. Park is human, they will claim you place expediency above our sacred traditions. Counselor Yunho's markings dimmed slightly as he considered this. You make a valid point, envoy. The political implications are significant. He turned to Tamin. Dr. Park, do you understand what is being asked of you? If we recognize this bond as legitimate, you would be expected to formalize a union with Envoy Jia. Not immediately, perhaps, but eventually. Tai Min felt as if the air had been sucked from the room. His medical training, his career in Earth Alliance, his whole life, none of it had prepared him for this moment. I need time to understand what this means, he said finally. A reasonable request, Counselor Yunho agreed. But be aware, time is a luxury we may not have. The Covenant's attempt to capture Envoy Jaya proves they are moving faster than we anticipated. We need stability in our diplomatic corps, not uncertainty. As the meeting concluded, Ta Min felt the weight of expectation settle on his shoulders. He had saved Jaya's life without hesitation, following his oath as a doctor. Now that single act of compassion had entangled him in alien politics, ancient traditions, and a bond he couldn't fully comprehend. And somewhere in the stars, the Covenant was watching, waiting to see what he would do. Tai Min stood alone in the Galileo's observation deck, staring at the stars. The Earth Alliance flagship, Intrepid, loomed large in the viewport, its massive hull dwarfing the research vessel. Aboard that ship, the Illyrian counselors were conferring with Alliance officials about the diplomatic crisis unfolding. 3 days had passed since the revelation about the life bond. 3 days of meetings, explanations, and growing pressure from both human and Illyrian authorities. Tai Min had barely slept. The door slid open behind him. He didn't need to turn to know it was Jia. Something about the life bond had made him strangely aware of her presence, as if some part of his mind was always attuned to her location. The counselors have reached a preliminary decision, she said softly, coming to stand beside him. Her luminescent markings pulsed slowly in a pattern he'd come to recognize as concern. And? Ta Min asked, still looking at the stars. They will honor the life bond as valid, Jaya said. The first recognized bond between our species. Tai Min closed his eyes briefly. What does that mean for us, practically speaking? Jaya turned to face the viewport as well. We would be expected to formalize the union within 1 Illyrian cycle, about 6 Earth months. You would be granted status as a member of House Telasra. With that would come diplomatic immunity, certain political responsibilities, and, she hesitated, the right to live among my people. Leave Earth Alliance. Leave my career. Ta Min's voice was quiet but tense. Jaya's markings dimmed slightly. Not necessarily. The counselors recognize this as unprecedented. They are willing to consider alternatives to traditional arrangements. A silence fell between them, filled with unspoken questions. I've been researching Illyrian culture, Tai Min finally said. The life bond originated as a protection for people whose lives were saved. The bond prevented the rescuer from claiming undue influence or exploiting the rescued person's gratitude. Jaya nodded. Yes. In ancient times, before we achieved our current social harmony, such exploitation was common. The life bond balanced the scales by creating mutual obligation. But I don't want any obligation from you, Tai Min said, turning to face her. I saved your life because it's my duty as a doctor, not to gain some claim over you. Jaya's silver eyes studied him. That selflessness is precisely why the bond formed, Ta Min. Not all bonds take root. They require certain compatibilities of spirit. Before he could respond, Ta Min's comm unit chimed. Dr. Park to Conference Room 1, came Captain He Jun's voice. The Alliance ambassador has arrived. The large conference room was crowded with officials from both species. Captain He Jun stood with Earth Alliance Ambassador Sang-Yi, a stern woman with decades of diplomatic experience. The 3 Illyrian counselors sat opposite them, their markings pulsing in complex patterns as they conversed quietly. "Dr. Park," Ambassador Sanghi nodded as Tamin and Jaya entered. "And Envoy Jia, please join us." As they took their seats, Tamin felt the weight of every gaze in the room. He was no longer just a ship's doctor, but a pivotal figure in an interspecies diplomatic crisis. "Let me be direct," Ambassador Sanghi began. "The situation presents both challenge and opportunity. The Shade Covenant's attack on an Earth Alliance vessel has provided us cause to increase security cooperation with the legitimate Illyrian government. However," she fixed Tamin with a pointed look, "the personal complication of this life bond presents difficulties." "With respect, Ambassador," Jaya said, her voice calm but firm, "the life bond is not a complication. It is a sacred tradition central to Illyrian culture." Counselor Yuno's markings pulsed in agreement. "Indeed, and therein lies our dilemma. If we dismiss the bond because Dr. Park is human, we undermine our own cultural foundations. If we uphold it, we create far-reaching precedent for human-Illyrian relations." Ambassador Sanghi nodded, "And Earth Alliance faces similar concerns. Dr. Park is a commissioned officer. His personal decisions have now become matters of interstellar diplomacy." Tamin listened, feeling increasingly like a pawn on a chessboard. "May I speak freely?" he asked. The ambassador nodded, and all eyes turned to him. "I've spent my career healing people regardless of species," Tamin said carefully. "I believe in the principle behind the life bond, that saving a life creates responsibility. But I'm troubled by how quickly this has become a political matter rather than a personal one." He looked directly at Jaya. "I barely know you, yet we're discussing a lifelong commitment. Not because we've chosen it, but because circumstances and tradition demand it." Jaya's markings pulsed rapidly, showing emotion despite her composed face. "Your concern is valid, Tamin. The traditional progression would allow for a period of acquaintance before formalization. But the political situation has accelerated everything." Counselor Hawan spoke up, her markings pulsing thoughtfully. "Perhaps there is a middle path. The bond exists that cannot be changed, but its expression might be adapted to these unique circumstances." "What do you mean?" Ambassador Sanghi asked. "In our oldest texts," Hawan explained, "the life bond took many forms. The union of houses was most common, but not universal. There were bonds of guardianship, of mentorship, of alliance." Captain Hejun, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. "Are you suggesting the bond could be honored without requiring Dr. Park and Envoy Jia to marry?" "Possibly," Counselor Hawan said, "though it would require study of the ancient texts and a formal ruling from the full council." Later that evening, Tamin found himself in the ship's library, surrounded by data pads containing translations of Illyrian cultural texts. Jia sat across from him, her silver eyes reflecting the soft light as she read. "Here," she said suddenly, pointing to a passage. "The bond of shared purpose. It was used when the saved and Savior had a common mission that served a greater good." Tamin read the passage, hope kindling. "And it didn't require marriage." "No. It recognized a different kind of union, a joining of paths rather than lives." Jaya's markings pulsed in a pattern he hadn't seen before. It was considered no less sacred, just different. Tamin looked up at her. "Would that satisfy your counselors? Would it protect your standing?" "Perhaps," Jaya said. "But Tamin, may I ask a difficult question?" He nodded. "Is your reluctance because you find me unsuitable?" Her markings dimmed slightly. "Because I am Illyrian." The question startled him. "No, not at all. You're—" He paused, suddenly aware of how little he actually knew about her beyond her courage and intelligence. "It's not about you being Illyrian. It's about being forced into a commitment neither of us chose." Jaya's markings shifted to a pattern he was beginning to recognize as understanding. "I see. Among my people, arranged unions based on compatibility metrics are common. The idea that bonding should follow personal choice is less central than in human culture. Tan Min considered this. Cultural differences ran deeper than he realized. In human history, arranged marriages were common too. But we've moved away from that practice. We believe personal connection should precede lifelong commitment. Yet you formed a connection strong enough to create the life bond. Jaya observed. Something in you recognized something in me, at a level deeper than conscious choice. Before Tan Min could respond, the ship's alert system activated. All senior staff to the bridge, came Captain Hejun's urgent voice. When they arrived at the bridge, the main view screen showed a disturbing sight. 3 Illyrian warships had appeared at the edge of the system. They're broadcasting on all frequencies, the communications officer reported. They claim to represent the new Illyrian authority and demand the surrender of the traitor Jia and her human accomplice. Counselor Yunho, who had joined them from the Intrepid, stared at the screen in horror. The Covenant has moved. They must have seized control of the military command. Jaya's markings pulsed rapidly with alarm. They're accelerating their timeline. This is a full coup. Tan Min looked from the approaching warships to Jaya, suddenly understanding the true scale of their dilemma. This was no longer just about cultural traditions or personal choices. The life bond had become a symbol in a civil war, and they were caught in the center of it. The Galileo's bridge fell silent as everyone stared at the approaching Illyrian warships. Their elegant, organic-looking hulls belied the deadly weapon systems they carried. Behind Tan Min, he heard Counselor Yunho speaking urgently into a communicator, calling for reinforcements from the legitimate Illyrian government. "We have 20 minutes before they're in weapons range," Captain Hejun said grimly. "The Intrepid is moving to intercept, but even an Alliance flagship can't take on 3 Illyrian warships alone." Jaya stepped forward, her markings pulsing with determination. "Captain, may I broadcast to those ships? Some of the crew may not know they're serving a coup." The captain nodded. "Communications, open a channel." Jaya stood tall as the channel opened. "This is Diplomatic Envoy Jia of House Tilasra, Council of 16. I speak to the honorable crews of the approaching vessels. You have been deceived. The Shade Covenant has violated our most sacred laws, assassinated legitimate counselors, and now attempts to drag our people into an interstellar conflict." She paused, her markings glowing intensely. "I stand with my lifebinder, protected by the oldest traditions of our people. To violate the life bond is to reject all that makes us Illyrian." The lead warship responded immediately. Commander Kunwu's face appeared on screen, his markings pulsing with controlled rage. "The traitor speaks of tradition, while hiding behind humans and perverting our sacred bonds. No true life bond can form with a lesser species." Tan Min felt a surge of anger at the commander's words, but before he could speak, Counselor Yunho stepped forward. "Commander Kunwu, I am Senior Counselor Yunho. I have personally verified the life bond between Envoy Jia and Dr. Park. It is genuine and recognized by council authority." Kunwu's markings flashed dismissively. "A council soon to be replaced. Stand aside, Counselor. This matter will be settled by the new authority." The transmission cut off. Captain Hejun turned to his tactical officer. "Status of the Intrepid. Moving to defensive position, Captain. They're contacting Earth Command for reinforcements, but the nearest battle group is 3 hours away." Ambassador Sanghi, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "We need time. If we can stall until reinforcements arrive, we might avoid bloodshed." Tan Min had been thinking rapidly during this exchange. He turned to Jita. "The life bond. Kunwu's fixated on it. He called it perverted, false." Jaya nodded. "In their propaganda, they've positioned themselves as traditionalists. They can't publicly oppose a life bond without losing support from conservative factions." Tan Min looked at the counselors. "What if we gave them something they couldn't ignore? Something so steeped in tradition that attacking us would cost them all credibility?" Counselor Hawan's markings pulsed with sudden understanding. You're suggesting a public bonding ceremony. Here, now, broadcast to all Illyrian ships and settlements. Time confirmed. Not the modern abbreviated version, but the ancient rite, with all its formalities. The full binding, Counselor Bin said, his markings pulsing rapidly. It hasn't been performed in public for centuries. It would take hours to complete. Hours we need. Ambassador Sangi noted. But Dr. Park, are you certain? This would be more than symbolism. A full binding is irrevocable under Illyrian law. Taimin looked at Jaya, truly seeing her not just as an alien diplomat or a patient, but as a person of courage and principle. I'm certain. Jaya's markings pulsed with emotion. Taimin, you don't have to do this. We could find another way. Is there another solution that would work as well? He asked quietly. After a moment, she shook her head. No. The full binding would force them to either respect it or brand themselves as heretics to our deepest traditions. Then let's do it. Taimin turned to the Illyrian counselors. What do we need? The next hour was a flurry of preparation. The Galileo's main cargo bay was quickly transformed into a ceremonial space. Illyrian officials from the Intrepid brought traditional objects and ceremonial attire. Captain Hejun ordered the ship's communication systems reconfigured to broadcast the ceremony across all Illyrian frequencies. As Taimin donned the formal Illyrian robes provided to him, silvery fabric that seemed to capture and reflect light in mesmerizing patterns, he felt strangely calm. What had begun as a medical emergency had become something he couldn't have imagined. A pivotal moment in human-Illyrian relations, centered on a bond he had formed unknowingly. Are you ready? Captain Hejun asked, entering the small room where Taimin was preparing. As ready as I can be, Taimin replied. Though I'm still learning the ceremonial words. The captain regarded him solemnly. You understand this is more than a delaying tactic. You're making history and committing yourself to something permanent. Taimin nodded. I know, but it feels right. Not just politically expedient, but right. When Taimin entered the cargo bay, he was stunned by the transformation. The space glowed with soft light that pulsed in patterns reminiscent of Illyrian markings. In the center stood 3 ritual pillars arranged in a triangle, each emitting a different colored light. Around them, Illyrian officials stood in formal positions, their markings synchronized in ceremonial patterns. Jaya waited at the far side, dressed in formal robes that complemented his own. Her markings pulsed with a pattern he hadn't seen before, anticipation, perhaps, or solemnity. Counselor Yunho gestured for Taimin to approach. The Covenant vessels maintained their approach, but have slowed. They're watching. All Illyrian frequencies are open. Taimin took his position opposite Jia. Between them, a small pedestal held a crystal vessel containing a luminescent fluid that reminded him of Jaya's markings. We begin the ritual of full binding, Counselor Yunho announced, his voice carrying both through the room and across the communications channels. A life bond formed in crisis now seeks formal recognition. What followed was unlike anything Taimin had experienced. The ceremony blended spoken vows with intricate movement patterns. Jia guided him subtly when needed, her eyes meeting his with reassurance. The crystal vessel between them gradually brightened as the ceremony progressed, responding to their proximity and shared words. 2 hours into the ceremony, Captain Hejun quietly approached Counselor Bin. The lead Covenant vessel is hailing us, he whispered. Bin's markings pulsed with satisfaction. They cannot interrupt the full binding without declaring themselves enemies of all tradition. Put them through, but maintain the ceremony. On a small screen positioned where only the officials could see it, Commander Kunwu's face appeared. His markings pulsed with barely controlled fury. This mockery will not save you. No human can truly perform the full binding. Yet he does so before witnesses, Counselor Yunho replied calmly. And our people watch. Will you be the first in our history to violate the sanctity of the full binding with violence? The commander's markings dimmed momentarily, revealing his uncertainty. This changes nothing. The new authority will. He was interrupted by another Illyrian officer who entered the frame, speaking urgently in his ear. Kun Wu's markings pulsed with alarm. 6 Illyrian defense cruisers have just arrived at the edge of the system, Captain He Jun informed Ta Min, and Jia quietly, loyal to the legitimate government. We've bought enough time. The ceremony continued despite this news. Ta Min and Jia completed each ritual step, their movements becoming more synchronized as they progressed. The crystal vessel between them now glowed brilliantly, casting patterns of light across their faces. In the final stage, they each placed a hand into the luminescent fluid. Tai Min felt a strange tingling sensation as the liquid seemed to flow around his fingers with purpose. When they withdrew their hands, identical patterns glowed on their palms, miniature versions of the markings that covered Jaya's skin. The bond is sealed and witnessed, Counselor Yunho declared. What the universe has joined, let no force divide. Outside the Galileo, the Covenant warships were retreating, facing the arrival of loyal Illyrian forces. The immediate danger had passed. Later, alone in a quiet observation room, Ta Min and Jia stood side by side, looking out at the stars. The mark on his palm still glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with hers. What happens now? Ta Min asked. Jaya's silver eyes met his. Now we discover what it truly means to be bonded across species. No one has walked this path before us. Will it be difficult? He asked. Undoubtedly, she answered honestly. There will be resistance, misunderstanding, political complications. Tai Min found himself smiling, but also discovery, new understanding between our peoples. Jaya's markings pulsed with what he now recognized as joy. Yes, and perhaps something more, between us. He looked down at their glowing palms, then back at the stars. What had begun as a medical emergency had become a bridge between worlds. Not a perfect solution, but a beginning. I'm ready, he said simply, and knew it was true.